Commander Zethkar stood on the bridge of his massive ship and looked at the blue planet below. Earth was a small world in a quiet part of space, but the humans who lived there had just learned how to send messages faster than light. This meant they were ready to meet other species from across the galaxy, according to Coalition rules. The Galactic Coalition had been watching Earth for many years. Scientists had studied the humans and found them to be weak and emotional, compared to other space-traveling races. They had soft skin that could be cut easily. They needed to breathe air constantly, and they seemed to cry over the smallest problems. Most Coalition members thought humans would need centuries of help before they could be useful partners in space. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was the first human to serve on a Coalition ship. He had been chosen to represent his species and learn about alien technology. Jake was 28 years old with brown hair and kind eyes, but the alien crew members found him strange. When they showed him their weapons that could destroy entire cities, he asked questions about protecting innocent people instead of being impressed by the power. When they demonstrated their shields that could stop any attack, he wanted to know if they had been tested against desperate enemies who had nothing left to lose. The other species in the Coalition were very different from humans. The Vorthak looked like walking crystals that sang to each other in beautiful voices. They were peaceful and wise but had never known war. The Namari were clouds of gas that floated through the air and thought with perfect logic about every problem. They could not understand why humans made decisions based on feelings. The Keleth were like giant insects that shared one mind across their entire species. They moved together like parts of a machine, and found human individuality confusing and wasteful. Captain Lisa Grant commanded the human warship UNS Defiance, which was anchored near the Coalition fleet. Her ship was small compared to the alien vessels, but it had been built for fighting. Lisa was 35 years old, with red hair tied back in a military style, and scars on her hands from working on engines. She had fought in Earth's last great war and understood that sometimes peaceful people had to do violent things to protect what they loved. The Coalition had sent their best ship to meet the humans. Commander Zethkar was from a species called the Threnodi, who looked like tall gray beings with 4 arms and large black eyes. His people had been exploring space for thousands of years and had never met a problem they could not solve with patience and superior technology. He thought humans were like children who had just learned to walk and would need careful guidance to avoid hurting themselves. Dr. Amy Watson worked in the science lab on the human ship. She was 26 years old with blonde hair and glasses, and she loved learning about alien life forms. She had studied every species in the Coalition and noticed something that worried her. None of them had ever faced a real enemy. All the alien races had evolved on safe worlds where the biggest dangers were natural disasters or resource shortages. Earth was different. Everything on Earth tried to kill everything else, and humans had survived by becoming very good at killing back. The peaceful meeting between humans and aliens was interrupted when emergency signals started coming from the outer edge of the galaxy. Colonies that had been thriving just days before had gone completely silent. Ships that went to investigate never returned. The few automated probes that made it back sent data that made no sense to Coalition scientists. Commander Zethkar called a meeting of all ship captains to discuss the crisis. The conference room was filled with different types of alien beings, but Jake Morrison was the only human present. The aliens spoke in calm voices about sending investigation teams and gathering more data before making any decisions. They had faced problems before by being patient and careful. Jake listened to their plans and felt a cold fear growing in his stomach. He had read the probe data and recognized something that the aliens did not understand. Whatever was destroying the colonies was not interested in negotiation or study. It was spreading fast and getting stronger with each world it consumed. Jake tried to explain his concerns, but the aliens thought he was being emotional and irrational like all humans. Captain Grant received a message from Jake about the meeting and immediately contacted Commander Zethkar. She requested permission to take her ship to the affected area and help with the investigation. The alien commander was polite but firm in his refusal. Human technology was primitive and their ship would only get in the way of a proper Coalition response. He suggested that humans should stay in safe space and let the experienced races handle the danger. Lisa Grant had spent her whole life being told she was not strong enough or smart enough to do important jobs. She had proved those people wrong by becoming one of Earth's best military commanders. She knew the look in Commander Zethkar's eyes because she had seen it many times before. He thought humans were weak and helpless and would panic when faced with real danger. The Coalition fleet prepared to depart for the outer colonies while the human ship was ordered to remain near Earth. Lisa watched the alien vessels with their smooth hulls and bright lights disappear into hyperspace. She thought about the probe data that Jake had shared with her. The energy readings looked familiar in a way that made her skin crawl. She had seen similar patterns during the war on Earth, when cities were attacked by weapons designed to cause maximum terror and suffering. Dr. Watson ran more analysis on the probe data in her laboratory. The computer system showed that whatever had attacked the colonies did not just destroy buildings and kill people. It seemed to feed on something that the Coalition databases could not identify. Amy had a theory that scared her, but she needed more information to be sure. She started checking Earth's historical records for anything that might match the attack patterns. Jake Morrison returned to the human ship and immediately went to see Captain Grant. He reported everything he had heard in the alien meeting, including their plan to approach the threat with standard exploration protocols. The Coalition species had never encountered an enemy that wanted to cause pain and fear instead of just taking resources. They were preparing to face an unknown danger with the same methods they used for peaceful first contact with new civilizations. Captain Grant made a decision that would change everything. She ordered her crew to prepare the UNS Defiance for immediate departure. They would follow the Coalition fleet to the outer colonies whether they had permission or not. Lisa had learned long ago that it was better to ask forgiveness than permission when lives were at stake. She suspected that the aliens were about to discover why humans had no natural predators on their homeworld, and why their planet had taught them to fight or die. The Coalition fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system and found complete silence. Commander Zethkar expected to see the usual signs of a thriving colony world with orbital stations, cargo ships, and communication signals filling the space around the planet. Instead, his sensors showed only empty metal shells floating like dead insects around a world that had been stripped bare of all life. The planet below looked like a skull. Where green forests and blue oceans should have been, there was only gray dirt and empty craters. The atmosphere readings showed no oxygen, no carbon dioxide, and no signs that anything had ever lived there. It was as if some massive force had sucked away everything that made the world alive, and left behind only rock and metal. Dr. Amy Watson watched the Coalition fleet from the bridge of the UNS Defiance as her ship approached the system. Captain Grant had ordered them to stay hidden behind a large asteroid while they observed what the aliens discovered. Amy felt sick as she looked at the dead world through her instruments. She had studied many planets during her career but had never seen anything like this complete destruction of life. Lieutenant Jake Morrison used his Coalition communication codes to listen to the alien fleet's reports. The different species were confused and frightened by what they found. The Vorthak were singing mournful songs for the lost colonists, while the Nimari ran calculations trying to understand what kind of weapon could cause such damage. The Keleth were unusually quiet as their shared minds struggled to process the horror of an entire world being murdered. Commander Zethkar led the first investigation team to the orbital stations around the dead planet. They found the structures intact, but completely empty of life. The stations still had power and their computers were still running, but every living being had simply vanished. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, and no clues about what had happened to the people who once lived and worked there. Dr. Watson received data from the Coalition investigation teams and immediately began her own analysis. The energy readings from the dead world showed something that made her hands shake as she worked. There were traces of an unknown force that seemed to feed on organic matter, but not in any way that normal science could explain. Whatever had attacked this place had not just killed the colonists but had somehow consumed their life energy itself. The human scientists had brought equipment that the Coalition did not have because Earth's violent history had taught them to study weapons and warfare in ways that peaceful species never needed to learn. Amy's instruments detected energy patterns that looked familiar from Earth's old battlefields, where chemical weapons had been used to cause maximum psychological damage to enemy forces. The readings suggested that the unknown attackers were not just trying to kill, but were trying to cause as much fear and suffering as possible. Captain Grant ordered her crew to battle stations as her instincts warned her that they were being watched. Lisa had survived many ambushes during Earth's wars, and she recognized the feeling of predators hiding in the darkness. She knew that whatever had destroyed this colony was probably still nearby and waiting for new victims to arrive. The trap was sprung when thousands of dark shapes emerged from behind the dead planet, like a swarm of angry insects. The enemy ships were unlike anything in the Coalition databases. They moved like living creatures instead of mechanical vessels, and their hulls seemed to pulse with a hungry darkness that made looking at them feel like staring into an open grave. Commander Zethkar immediately ordered defensive positions as his fleet prepared to face the unknown enemy. The Coalition had superior technology and more experience with space combat, so he expected the battle to be over quickly. The alien ships looked primitive and moved in chaotic patterns that suggested they had no real military training or organization. The first exchange of weapons fire showed how wrong the Coalition assumptions had been. The enemy ships ignored the powerful energy beams that should have destroyed them, and instead unleashed attacks that bypassed all known types of shields and armor. Coalition crews began reporting that their people were dying at their stations, even though their ships had taken no physical damage. Dr. Watson monitored the battle from the human ship and watched in horror as Coalition vessels began going dark one by one. The alien crews were not being killed by explosions or energy weapons, but were simply dying of terror. Her instruments showed that the unknown enemy was somehow draining the life force directly from living beings across vast distances of space. Jake Morrison listened to the panicked communications from his former shipmates as they described what was happening to them. The Coalition crews were experiencing visions of absolute horror that drove them insane or killed them outright. The peaceful alien species had never learned to fight against psychological warfare and had no defenses against attacks that targeted their minds instead of their bodies. Captain Grant saw the Coalition fleet being slaughtered and made the decision that would change how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. She ordered the UNS Defiance to drop its stealth systems and charge directly into the center of the enemy formation. Her crew looked at her like she had lost her mind, but they followed orders because they trusted their captain to know what she was doing. The enemy ships turned their attention to the small human vessel as it raced toward them, with all weapons firing. The creatures that commanded those dark ships had fed on the fear and suffering of countless civilizations across thousands of years. They had never met a species that could resist their psychological attacks and expected the humans to die even faster than the other aliens had. Something went wrong with the enemy feeding process when they tried to drain the life from the human crew. Instead of collapsing in terror like the Coalition forces had done, the humans seemed to become more dangerous as the attack continued. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres felt the wave of pure fear wash over him and responded by laughing as he loaded his weapons and prepared to board the enemy ship that had latched onto their hull. The creatures had evolved to consume terror, but they had never encountered a species that transformed fear into fury. Engineer Pete Collins was trapped in a section of the ship that was being dissolved by enemy bioweapons, but instead of surrendering, he began singing an old Earth war song while he rigged the reactor to explode and take 3 enemy vessels with him. Commander Zethkar watched from his damaged flagship as the impossible happened. The humans were not just surviving the psychic attacks that had destroyed his fleet, but were actually fighting back and winning. He began to understand that Earth had produced something the galaxy had never seen before, and he was not sure if he should be grateful or terrified that they were on his side. The UNS Defiance slammed into the heart of the enemy formation, like a bullet fired into a nest of wasps. Captain Grant had gambled everything on her understanding of human psychology, and so far her bet was paying off. The dark ships that had easily destroyed the Coalition fleet were having trouble dealing with a species that seemed to get stronger when faced with their worst fears. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres kicked down the airlock door as enemy creatures poured into his ship. The beings looked like living shadows with too many teeth and eyes that showed the depths of space itself. Most intelligent species would have gone insane just from looking at them, but Mike had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit and had seen plenty of things that wanted to hurt him. He raised his plasma rifle and grinned as he started shooting. The creatures tried to feed on Mike's terror but found something they had never encountered before. Humans had evolved on a world where everything tried to kill them, and they had learned to turn fear into a weapon. Instead of being paralyzed by the psychic attack, Mike felt his heart rate increase and his reflexes speed up as adrenaline flooded his system. The biological response that should have made him helpless instead made him more dangerous than he had ever been in his life. Dr. Amy Watson monitored the crew's vital signs from her laboratory and made discoveries that amazed her. Human brain chemistry was completely different from other species when faced with mortal danger. Where alien nervous systems shut down under extreme stress, human systems seemed to unlock hidden reserves of strength and speed. The fear-feeding process that killed other races was actually making her shipmates faster, stronger, and more creative in their fighting. Lieutenant Jake Morrison coordinated the battle from the bridge while enemy bioweapons ate through the hull around him. He should have been terrified as acid burned through the metal walls, but instead he found himself thinking more clearly than ever before. His training had taught him that fear was just information about danger, and the key to survival was using that information to make better decisions. The creatures attacking his ship had never faced prey that could think rationally while being consumed alive. Engineer Pete Collins was trapped in the reactor room as enemy. Organisms began dissolving the containment systems around him. Most beings would have begged for mercy or tried to escape, but Pete had grown up on a farm where he learned that sometimes you had to sacrifice yourself to protect the herd. He began manually overriding safety systems while humming an old song his grandfather had taught him about soldiers who died, protecting their friends. The enemy creatures surrounding Pete expected him to break down and feed them with his terror as he faced certain death. Instead, they found themselves dealing with a human who had accepted that life was temporary and was now focused on making his death as expensive as possible for his enemies. Pete jury-rigged the reactor to explode with enough force to destroy 3 enemy ships while laughing at old jokes he remembered from his childhood. Commander Zethkar watched the impossible battle from his damaged bridge and tried to understand what he was seeing. His people had studied warfare for thousands of years, but had never encountered anything like human combat behavior. The aliens fought to preserve their lives and would surrender when defeat became certain. Humans seemed to fight hardest when they were about to lose and treated their own deaths as just another tactical option. The battle turned when Captain Grant implemented what she called Protocol 7. Instead of keeping her crew together in defensive positions, she scattered them throughout the ship and told them to hunt the invaders in small groups. This strategy made no sense to Commander Zethkar because it meant the humans would be outnumbered and cut off from support. Most military doctrines taught that dividing your forces in the face of a superior enemy was suicide. Corporal Nina Parker led a 3-person team through the ventilation systems to attack enemy boarding parties from unexpected directions. The creatures had evolved to feed on the terror of cornered prey, but found themselves being hunted by predators who used the ship's own structure as a weapon. Nina and her team turned off the artificial gravity in sections where enemies had gathered and used the confusion to attack with improvised explosives made from cleaning supplies. The enemy ships began pulling back from the human vessel as their feeding process continued to fail. The creatures had conquered countless civilizations by making their victims afraid to fight back, but humans seemed to become more dangerous the more frightened they became. The dark ship started targeting the human vessel with conventional weapons instead of their fear-feeding systems, but found that humans were just as effective at dealing with regular combat. Dr. Watson realized why the enemy's psychological attacks were backfiring so badly on human targets. Earth's evolutionary history had been shaped by constant predation and environmental disasters that killed any beings who could not function while terrified. Human ancestors who froze when faced with saber-toothed cats had been eliminated from the gene pool millions of years ago. Only humans who could think and fight while experiencing maximum terror had survived to reproduce. The coalition crews who were still alive watched in amazement as the human ship not only survived the enemy assault but began hunting the attackers through the asteroid field. Captain Grant's crew used tactics that seemed insane to other species but made perfect sense to beings who had evolved as persistence hunters on a death world. They spread out to deny the enemy easy targets and used their ship's superior speed to pick off isolated enemy vessels. Jake Morrison coordinated with the surviving coalition ships to share tactical information about the enemy. He tried to explain that humans had learned to use fear as fuel for their combat effectiveness, rather than allowing it to paralyze them. The alien commanders found this concept almost impossible to understand, because their species had never needed to develop such extreme survival responses. The enemy formation began to collapse as the Creatures discovered that their primary weapon was worse than useless against human targets. Staff Sergeant Torres led boarding parties onto damaged enemy ships and found beings that had fed on terror. For so long, they had forgotten how to fight opponents who were not afraid of them. The human Marines treated each enemy vessel like a puzzle to be solved through applied violence and creative use of explosives. Commander Zethkar finally understood why Earth had produced a species with no natural predators. Humans were not the victims in their ecosystem, but the apex predators who had survived by being more dangerous than anything else on their planet. The galaxy was about to learn that the small blue world had not sent them allies but had unleashed hunters who had chosen to protect the pack instead of consuming it. Word spread through both fleets about what the humans had accomplished, and the surviving alien crews began to see their new allies in a completely different light. The coalition species that had thought humans were weak and emotional now watched in fascination as human boarding parties not only resisted the fear-feeding attacks, but seemed to grow stronger and more effective as the enemy psychological pressure increased. Corporal Nina Parker received orders to lead a joint rescue mission to save coalition survivors who were trapped on a partially consumed orbital station. The structure was crawling with enemy creatures that had been feeding on the terror of alien refugees for hours. Nina assembled a team of 6 humans and 12 volunteers from different coalition species, who were willing to risk their lives for their trapped comrades. The rescue team approached the station through a field of debris that had once been cargo ships and patrol vessels. Nina could see the fear in the eyes of her alien teammates as they got closer to the structure. The coalition species had never learned to function while experiencing maximum terror, because their homeworlds had been safe places where such extreme emotions were rarely needed. Nina tried to explain that fear was just another type of sensory input that could be used to make better tactical decisions. Dr. Amy Watson coordinated the rescue mission from her laboratory while analyzing the energy patterns around the infected station. Her instruments showed that the enemy creatures were not just consuming organic matter, but were somehow feeding on the emotional energy produced by their victims. The aliens trapped inside were being kept alive specifically so they would continue producing terror for the creatures to consume. Lieutenant Jake Morrison worked with coalition communication specialists to establish contact with survivors inside the station. The alien voices that answered their calls were barely recognizable as intelligent speech because the prolonged exposure to fear-feeding had damaged their ability to think rationally. Jake realized that the enemy was not just killing the coalition forces, but was torturing them psychologically until their minds broke completely. The rescue team entered the station through a damaged airlock and immediately encountered creatures that looked like living nightmares. The beings were made of darkness and hunger with eyes that showed the deaths of entire civilizations. Most intelligent species would have turned and fled after seeing such horrors, but Nina Parker had grown up watching Earth horror movies and had developed an immunity to being scared by ugly monsters. Commander Zethkar monitored the rescue mission from his flagship and tried to understand how humans could function in conditions that paralyzed his own people. The coalition survivors inside the station had been reduced to gibbering terror after just hours of exposure to the enemy creatures. The human rescue team seemed to treat the same creatures as merely another tactical problem to be solved through superior firepower and creative thinking. The battle inside the station became a running fight through corridors filled with alien bioweapons and creatures that fed on fear. Nina's team used tactics that seemed completely insane to their coalition allies, but proved devastatingly effective against enemies who expected their victims to be paralyzed by terror. The humans sang old Earth war songs while they fought and made jokes about their situation even as acid burned through their armor. Private Dan Kelly found a group of Vorthak survivors huddled in a storage room, while crystalline creatures tried to break down the door. The aliens were singing death songs and preparing to surrender because they believed rescue was impossible. Dan had different ideas about what was impossible and began setting shape charges around the room while explaining his plan to use the enemy's own feeding process against them by creating a feedback loop in their psychic connection. The coalition team members who were working with the humans began to understand why Earth had produced such effective warriors. Human children grew up playing games that taught them to face their fears and overcome them through determination and teamwork. Other species protected their young from anything that might cause distress, but human cultures deliberately exposed children to controlled amounts of fear to build their psychological resistance. Dr. Watson discovered that human brain chemistry was uniquely suited to resist the enemy feeding process. Human neural pathways had evolved to handle extreme stress by increasing focus and reaction speed rather than shutting down like other species did. The fear-feeding attacks that crippled coalition forces actually improved human combat performance by activating ancient survival responses that had kept their ancestors alive on a dangerous world. The rescue mission turned into a systematic extermination of enemy creatures as the human team cleared the station room by room. Sergeant Frank Davis led his squad through sections that had been completely consumed by alien biomatter and used flamethrowers to burn out infestations while rescued coalition survivors watched in amazement. The humans treated the horrific alien organisms like any other vermin that needed to be eliminated. Captain Grant coordinated multiple rescue operations throughout the system as more human ships arrived from Earth. The reinforcements brought weapons and tactics that had been developed during humanity's violent history of warfare against other humans. The coalition crews were shocked to learn that humans had spent centuries developing methods to fight opponents who were just as intelligent and ruthless as themselves. The enemy creatures began to retreat from the human forces as their primary feeding method continued to fail completely. The beings had evolved to consume civilizations by breaking their will to fight, but humans seemed to become more determined and effective the more hopeless their situation became. Staff Sergeant Torres reported that enemy creatures were actually fleeing from human boarding parties instead of trying to feed on them. Lieutenant Morrison helped establish a new tactical doctrine that combined human psychological resistance with coalition technology and numbers. The Alliance learned to use human troops as shock forces who could penetrate enemy positions while alien forces provided fire support and technical expertise. The mixed teams proved far more effective than either species could manage alone. Commander Zethkar began to understand that the galaxy had been incredibly fortunate that humans had chosen to be protectors rather than conquerors. A species that treated certain death as merely another problem to solve and could function at peak efficiency, while experiencing maximum terror would have been unstoppable if they had decided to expand their territory through force. The coalition had gained allies who were essentially immune to the most common form of psychological warfare in the galaxy. The tide of battle turned completely when Captain Grant implemented a strategy called the human wave. Instead of retreating, when faced with superior numbers, human forces would charge directly at the enemy while their coalition allies provided covering fire. The enemy creatures had never encountered opponents who became more dangerous when they should have been most afraid, and had no tactical response to beings who treated their own deaths as acceptable losses in exchange for mission success. The rescue operations continued throughout the system as human forces systematically cleared every station and outpost of enemy creatures. Dr. Watson documented the psychological profiles of different species and how they responded to extreme fear. Her research would later become the foundation for new training programs that taught coalition forces how to resist similar attacks in the future. The final battle began when the combined human and coalition forces located the source of the enemy invasion near the center of the dead system. A massive organic structure floated in space like a diseased planet, pulsing with dark energy that made every sensor screen flicker with static. The enemy mothership was larger than anything the coalition had ever encountered and appeared to be a living creature that had been consuming civilizations for thousands of years. Commander Zethkar assembled the fleet commanders for a final strategy meeting. Aboard his damaged flagship, the alien leaders spoke quietly about defensive positions and evacuation plans because they knew their combined forces could not defeat something so large and ancient. The creature had destroyed dozens of worlds and absorbed the life energy of billions of beings over the centuries. Every tactical simulation showed that any direct assault would end in complete annihilation. Captain Lisa, Grant listened to the alien discussions and felt the familiar cold anger that had carried her through Earth's worst battles. She recognized the tone in the coalition commanders' voices because she had heard it before from generals who were preparing to surrender rather than sacrifice more lives in a hopeless cause. Lisa had never learned how to surrender and was not planning to start learning now. Dr. Amy Watson studied the sensor readings from the mothership and made a discovery that chilled her to the bone. The massive creature was not just consuming organic matter, but was somehow feeding on the concept of hope itself. Every civilization it had encountered had eventually given up fighting and allowed themselves to be consumed because the psychological pressure had broken their will to continue. The creature had never faced a species that did not know how to quit. Lieutenant Jake Morrison worked with coalition technicians to develop a plan for penetrating the creature's defenses. The mothership was protected by layers of bioarmor that could regenerate faster than conventional weapons could damage it. The only way to hurt something so large would be to attack it from the inside using weapons that could not be healed or regenerated. Captain Grant made the decision that would define how the galaxy remembered this battle. She ordered her crew to load the UNS Defiance with every nuclear weapon humanity had brought to the stars and prepare for a direct assault on the creature's core. When Commander Zethkar protested that this was clearly a suicide mission, Lisa simply replied that this was what humans did when something threatened their pack. The human crew received their orders with the calm acceptance that had puzzled alien observers throughout the conflict. Other species would have mutinied or demanded time to say goodbye to their families, but the humans simply checked their equipment and prepared to die, taking their enemy with them. Engineer Pete Collins had been replaced by Chief Warrant Officer Bob Martinez, who treated the mission like any other technical challenge that needed to be solved. The final approach began as the UNS Defiance separated from the fleet and accelerated toward the massive creature at maximum speed. The mothership detected the incoming threat and unleashed its most powerful psychic attack, flooding the human ship with visions of death, suffering, and the complete meaninglessness of existence. Other species throughout the galaxy had been driven mad by exposure to such concentrated despair and had willingly surrendered to be consumed. Commander Zethkar monitored the human communications during their final approach and heard something that changed his understanding of what courage really meant. Instead of screams of terror or prayers for salvation, the human crew was sharing jokes about their situation and making plans for what they would do if they somehow survived. Navigator Helen Shaw was heard saying that at least they would have an interesting story to tell at the next family reunion. The creature increased the intensity of its psychic assault as the human ship penetrated deeper into its biodefenses. The attack was designed to show victims the futility of resistance and the inevitability of their consumption by forces beyond their comprehension. Humans experienced the same visions as other species but interpreted them differently, because Earth had taught them that life was temporary and dangerous regardless of what they chose to do. Dr. Watson continued her research even as the ship shook apart around her and reported her final discovery to the Coalition fleet. The enemy creatures were themselves afraid for the first time in their existence. They had evolved to consume beings who could be broken by showing them how small and helpless they were in an infinite universe. Humans already knew they were small and helpless, but had decided to fight anyway because the alternative was giving up without trying. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres led the final boarding action against creatures that had fed on the terror of entire civilizations. The enemy beings tried to break his will by showing him visions of Earth being consumed and everyone he loved being tortured to death. Mike looked at the nightmarish images and felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had kept his ancestors alive when everything else had failed. He began methodically killing every creature he could reach while humming lullabies his mother had sung to him as a child. The mothership's defenses began to collapse as the creature experienced something it had never felt before. The humans inside its body were not being consumed by despair, but were actually becoming more effective as fighters the more hopeless their situation became. Corporal Nina Parker was setting demolition charges in the creature's vital organs while explaining to her team that fear was just another word for paying attention to important details. Captain Grant reached the central core of the creature and began the final arming sequence for the nuclear weapons. The ancient being tried one last desperate psychic attack, showing her the deaths of every human who had ever lived and the eventual extinction of her entire species. Lisa looked at the visions and felt sad for all the people who had died, but also proud that they had lived at all in a universe that did not care about their existence. The creature finally understood what true terror felt like as it realized that these beings could not be broken because they had already accepted that everything ended eventually. Humans fought not because they believed they could win, but because fighting was better than surrendering. They had learned to find meaning in struggle itself rather than in victory or survival. The nuclear detonation inside the mothership created a chain reaction that destroyed the creature and sent shockwaves through the enemy fleet. The remaining alien ships fled into deep space rather than face more opponents who treated certain death as just another tactical option. Commander Zethkar watched the explosion and knew that the galaxy had been saved by beings who were more terrifying than the monsters they had defeated. The rescue ships found human survivors scattered throughout the debris field in emergency pods and makeshift shelters. Dr. Watson was discovered alive in a medical bay she had converted into a fortress using surgical equipment and pure stubbornness. When asked how she had survived being consumed by alien biomatter, she explained that fear was just data, and what you did with that data was what made you human. The final report, filed by Commander Zethkar, recommended that humanity be offered full membership in the Galactic Coalition, not as junior partners but as the species other civilizations would call when something needed to die and would not stay dead. The galaxy would never look at the small blue planet the same way again, and neither would the things that lurked in the darkness between the stars.